thank you all today for joining this month's Communicating Your Science event, where we talk about better ways to communicate science to the public and make science more inclusive. I'm going to turn this over to Joshua Brumberg, who is our Dean for the Sciences at the CUNY Graduate Center. He's also a professor of psychology, biology, and neuroscience at Queens College and the Graduate Center, where his lab studies how environmental experience impacts development and function of cortical circuits. And Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our illustrious guests and to get the conversation started.
Thank you very much, Sean, and special thanks to Sean and Josephine, who've really organizing this overall series of learning how to communicate about science. We're really pleased to have today one of the foremost communicators of science with us, Malcolm Gladwell, who is the author of several New York Times bestsellers, including The Tipping Point, Blink, and Outliers. He's also the co-founder of Pushkin Industries, which produces his podcast, Revisionist History. Gladwell's early career highlights include covering business and science for the Washington Post and penning articles for the New Yorker that explore and challenge our ingrained social theories, structures, and beliefs. He has been included in the Time 100 Most Influential People list and is touted as one of foreign policy's top global thinkers. His recent audiobook, I Hate the Ivy League, Riffs and Rants on Elite Education, compiles curated episodes from the Revisionist History podcast that explore how we can do a better job at making higher education more affordable, fair, and open to all. So welcome, Malcolm. And just to let everyone know what we're going to do is I'm going to ask some questions of Malcolm and go along as questions come up, because this is kind of, we kept it as a Zoom meeting style. Throw your questions in the chat and we'll ask a couple of you to then unmute and get to ask your question directly of Malcolm. So starting off, looking at your history, Malcolm, did you envision that you would wind up where you are today as a child, or how did you, the successive stages that got you where you are today?
Yeah, no, I didn't really, I didn't think I would end up as a journalist. I had no kind of particular ambitions in that direction even when I was in college. It was all kind of very serendipitous. It's just the first job I got out of college was with a magazine, and I stayed in that world ever since.
And I know you started covering business and then science, and then you kind of gone, and I see you really getting interested in social science issues. Can you talk a little bit about the development of that and your interest in that?
Yeah, I mean, I was, my real career began at the Washington Post. And, when you're a journalist at the Washington Post, you're usually a generalist. So to cover, foreign policy at the Washington Post they don't require you to have a PhD in political science. To cover science for the Washington Post, they don't ask that you have a PhD in science. They just expect you to be curious and work hard and ask the right, ask good questions. And the journalist, the reporter starts at the same position as his or her audience does. And so it's almost an advantage to kind of start at the bottom, and so I don't get ahead of my audience. So I was I didn't really know anything about science at all. I'd never studied science in school. But I at the Washington Post was offered a chance to be a science writer after I'd been a business reporter for a few years, and thought it would be interesting. And we had a group of people who covered science, and the physical sciences were already covered by others. So what was left was the social sciences. And I thought, all right, I'll write about that. There was never any master plan. And I quickly discovered that I really loved the social sciences. But that was, if you'd asked me in college if I would be someone who loved, I had never took a single course in psychology or anything like sociology or anything like that in college. So it was all a kind of, following my nose, as my father used to say.
Well, this being the Communicating Your Science series, when you were interviewing scientists, or if you were telling budding scientists if they ever get the opportunity to talk to a journalist, how should they go about explaining what they're doing so the journalist can really understand what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, there's two things that are important. One is that as a journalist, you have to do your homework. So you can't call up, at the Washington Post, I would be calling up famous scientists. I mean, you can't call up a famous scientist and expect them to give you a freshman level tutorial in their field. That's disrespectful. I mean, so you have to make some effort to educate yourself first. Now, can you educate yourself to their level? Of course not, but at least to the point where you can ask intelligent questions. So that's part one. Is I always tried to, if I was going to call someone up about a paper they had written, I read the paper. And I began with, here are the things I didn't understand in the paper, right? That's a much better starting off point than tell me about the paper you wrote, right? Which is disrespectful. Like it's publicly available for a reason. And what I found is that the wonderful thing about science in this country is that we ask almost all scientists to be both researchers and teachers. And so they're used to teaching. So, if you show interest and ask smart questions, they will put down what they're doing and answer them. So I've always been enormously kind of gratified by that kind of response. And the other thing I found is that, the reason I think scientists of all kinds are willing to take calls from journalists like me is that we offer them the one thing they don't have, which is access to the broader public, right? I've interviewed psychologists or whatever, sociologists, neuroscientists in my career who within their own field are world famous. I mean, they may win Nobel Prizes eventually, but the public doesn't know who they are. And that's sort of a shame. But the only way the public is going to know who they are is if a journalist such as myself writes about what they're doing for a popular audience. And so I think scientists recognize that, and that's why they do welcome the call.
So in general, when you reached out to scientists, are they always welcoming and answering, or do some people just blow you off?
I have almost never in 35 years of doing this, I don't think I've ever had someone blow me off. I mean, it's a tribute, I think, to the generosity of the field. I mean, remember as well that the third thing that scientists have is, they're teachers, they're researchers, but they're also colleagues. They all belong to a community of people who are interested in sharing and learning from each other. That's a huge part of academic culture in this country, that collegiality. And so I think they think of speaking to journalists as part of that, of sharing and their knowledge with the hope of kind of making the world a little bit of a better place.
We've seen in the past couple of years with COVID, kind of the role that science or the belief in scientific facts have then influenced public policy or acceptance of certain things like, say, vaccines. Do you think scientific journalists play a role in helping further certain societal goals?
I do. I think, and I think what we learned during COVID was that we probably need more science journalists and need to give them a bigger voice. I was struck, periodically I would, go and read things that people who were, for example, COVID deniers or anti-vax people have written. The thing that struck me was how much many of them misunderstand really, really basic things about how science works. They thought a vaccine was by definition something that was 100% good in preventing infection. Well, vaccines never, there are examples of vaccines that can do that, but that's not the formal definition of a vaccine. And no scientist would ever say that. I remember reading this long, angry kind of post by someone, talking about how the clinical trials for the COVID vaccines did not examine the question of how contagious someone who was vaccinated was. And well, the answer to that is, that's a really hard study to do. And if you're trying to rush a vaccine to market because millions of people are dying, your primary interest is, can I keep the person who's infected alive? And maybe later you can start to kind of figure out just how much being vaccinated reduces your contagiousness. But it's just that kind of, there was this sort of widespread ignorance of the way science worked among some of the critics. And I don't blame the critics for their ignorance. I blame the rest of us. It's our job, science journalist's job and the world of science's job, to educate the public in a meaningful way. And I think maybe we were so overwhelmed with the task of fighting COVID that kind of fell by the wayside.
And did you ever feel as like a science journalist at a periodical like the New Yorker, which is seen as this hoity-toity literary publication, as bringing something different, or were you put in the little corner in the side and we say we tolerate Malcolm because he's a good writer?
No, there's a long tradition at the New Yorker and magazines like it of science writing going back 70, 80 years. So I always felt that what I was writing about was very much part of the kind of mainstream at the New Yorker. I think the appetite for thoughtful science writing is much greater than the supply. If anything, the world wants more. The problem is there's a limited number of people who are willing to kind of take the extra effort it requires to write a good science piece. I mean, if I wanted to write a piece about the re-election prospects of Joe Biden, I would have a much shorter kind of learning curve than I would if I wanted to write about cutting edge research fighting Alzheimer's disease, right? It takes more. And so there's a limited number of people who are willing to put in that extra effort to learn specialized areas of science. It's not accessible in the same way.
And how did you go from the long form journalism like New Yorker and to the jump to podcasts?
I mean, again, there was no plan, but a friend of mine was running a company that produced podcasts and asked me if I wanted to try one. And I said, sure. I mean, it's as simple as that. I thought it was going to be a little lark that would last a couple of years and I would go back to writing. But it turns out I enjoyed so much that I've stuck with it. It's a very different, doing a podcast is a very, very different animal than writing an article or a book. It really, it takes different muscles and you tell very different kinds of stories. And so I really enjoyed that kind of late career shakeup.
Seems like your autobiography will be entitled Serendipity.
Yes, I'm a big believer in, I've never been a big planner. I sort of go where the winds blow me.
So one of the things that, when I first started listening to Revisionist History, you had kind of in the first season, you had this 3-show arc about is enough, having to do with institutions. And for those that haven't heard this, the first was about a university that used to be called, I think, Glassboro State, which then got the first really mega donation in U.S. higher education history, was $100 million, and now is Rowan and transformed the institution. And what was about that kind of resonated with you?
Well, I was just struck by the fact that rich people in this country tend to give their money, when they give money to higher education, they tend to give it to institutions that are also rich, which I don't understand. Why? What triggered it was, there was a hedge fund billionaire who gave a $400 million gift to Harvard University. And, everyone praised this person for his extraordinary generosity. He was a kind of philanthropic hero. But Harvard University has $50 billion in the bank. Why are we praising someone who wants to give them an extra $400 million? There are a virtually limitless list of colleges in this country where $400 million would make the difference, an enormous difference. I mean, it would allow them to dramatically improve the quality of the education or the kinds of people that they're serving. It doesn't make any difference to Harvard if you give them another $400 million. So, I was puzzled by this. What's wrong with rich people? Like, what theory is driving them to think that the best use of their money is to give it to institutions that are already wealthy. And I wanted to tell the story of Glassboro State because it was a story about the opposite, the rare rich person who decided to give his money to an institution that didn't have money. And it pains me to think that you have to, in this day and age, have to make a lesson out of that, but I guess you do.
And has anyone, and you had a famous conversation as this story arc continues with the president of Stanford. Is enough is enough. And I don't think he accepted that premise, that there's never enough.
Well, I asked him, his Stanford's endowment at the time was $25 billion. And I asked him, is there ever a point where you would say, okay, we have enough, and any dollar that's donated to Stanford, we're now going to donate somewhere else to a school that doesn't have a lot of money? And he said, no, there's never a point where I would say we had enough. So an institution with $25 billion in the bank can honestly say they want more. I find that striking. I honestly don't know. It's not like Stanford it's not the University of Michigan. It doesn't have 80,000 undergraduates. It's a pretty small place. 25 billion, across 8,000 undergraduates is a lot of money. I don't really know why someone thinks they need more than that.
Now, one of the issues that kind of, if folks listen to the I Hate the Ivy Leagues, which, by the way, was one of the hooks with that I was able to convince Malcolm to come on with us, because if you hate the Ivy League, you got to root for CUNY.
Exactly.
The poor man's Harvard, as it was called back in the day. What is the role of public institutions or private institutions in terms of making STEM accessible to more and more students? Yeah.
Well, I did in a subsequent podcast, I did an episode about a little historically Black college in New Orleans called Dillard, which is a school of, I've forgotten how many undergraduates, maybe 1,000, slightly more than that. And I was struck by one thing, which is that every year Dillard graduates more people with physics degrees than Black students with physics degrees than Harvard graduates, right? So you've got mighty Harvard with its $50 billion in the bank, which is going out there and recruiting, the most brilliant students in the country. But who at the end of the day actually gives the world more African-American STEM graduates? Tiny Dillard down in New Orleans that probably has a 1/1000th of the money in the bank that Harvard does, the resources, the money in them. And it made me realize that, if we think we have a problem with extending opportunities in STEM to minority students, to disadvantaged students, the solution is not coming from the Ivy Leagues. These guys, if Harvard was interested in producing more Black physics majors, they could do it. They're not interested. And at a certain point, I just say, you know what? I'm not going to wait forever for these guys to come around and to exercise their social conscience. The truth is that the real engines of social mobility in this country are not the fancy schools. They are the schools that do the real work of educating students who are maybe the first in their family to go to college, who don't come from a lot of money, and giving them real opportunities to rise up the social and economic ladder. That's where I believe our focus should be. The second part of this is, it's just a numbers game. The Ivy League, the 7 schools, the Ivy League schools plus Stanford University collectively educate 100,000 students a year, right? The rest of the country educates, God knows how many, I've forgotten what it is, 3-4 million undergraduates a year. You can't get anywhere with the fancy schools. They simply aren't large enough, right? My alma mater, University of Toronto, which is considered to be one of the stronger students in colleges in Canada, we've got 60,000 undergraduates. Canadian universities, Canada's a tiny country. Our schools are big. McGill is 40 to 45,000 undergraduates. UBC, in California is about 50 or 60,000 undergraduates. This is a country of 28 million people that has, schools should be big. You can't, if you're not big, you're not making a difference, right? It's like, we have this fantasy. Everyone wants to go to a school that's got like 500 people and you can know everyone by name. That's great, but a school with 500 undergraduates does not move the needle in any appreciable way in making the country a better place. It's just not big enough. If you want to feed the hungry and all you have is a food truck, you're not going to feed many hungry people, right?
Right.
So, they're fancy food trucks, those schools.
Well, I mean, it's a good comparison with Canada, where University of Toronto is a public university, University of British Columbia, I assume, is a public university. So many of the premier institutions are public, but
all of the premier.
Is McGill public, or is that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I wasn't aware.
Yeah.
So why did the higher education system in Canada develop that way? And do you have any thoughts? While in America, it's much more of a mixed bag. Obviously, the Ivies are private. Michigan, the University of North Carolina public, but
yeah, it's a kind of quirk of the fact that a lot of the private American universities, the original ones, are very old, so they predated the notion that government should be actively involved in higher education. I don't have an issue with private education. I do think that, what has happened is that because private schools get so much attention in the culture and attention from philanthropists and such, we've starved the public component of education. The amount of money on a kind of on a per capita basis that goes to public education today is a fraction of what it was in the 1950s. I mean, so it's like, that's the problem. The problem is that we've somehow thought that that the public sector shouldn't play a role in aggressively funding higher education. The generation of people who served in the Second World War, when they came home for the war, they were getting, the GI Bill meant that people could get, the tuition was, in contemporary terms, unbelievably low. A huge group of people were going to college, graduating with a degree that helped them improve the lot of their families, and were carrying no debt, right? That's a huge thing. Today, schools still provide opportunity, but we generally saddle the students who graduate with so much debt that it impairs their ability to actively participate in the economy once they graduate. That's wrong. It's just wrong. And there's no reason for a country as wealthy as ours to tolerate a system where we're just loading up students with a lot of debt just because they want to go to college.
One of the things, bringing these two threads together when you read the New York Times in the morning, most of the time in the science articles, when they reach out to quote unquote experts, they're at the schools we've been talking about. They're not reaching out to schools like CUNY. Mm-hmm. Similarly, when we talk about the impact of those colleges on the well-being of people, the best example I say is, in terms of social mobility, CUNY does 2 standard deviations better than when you add up all the Ivy Leagues, Chicago and Stanford. Of course, study was funded by Mike Bloomberg, who gives all his money to Johns Hopkins. But the fact that CUNY did this, that was actually in the 11th paragraph. And so how do schools like CUNY get to the point where a journalist like yourself, or science journalists more generally, recognize that we have a story to tell?
Yeah, that's a hugely interesting and complicated question. I don't have a good answer. I will say, and you know this, that one of the things that exclusive wealthy schools do with their money is they very, very aggressively market their own faculty and the research of their faculty. So why does a journalist cover a particular story? Well, it's because very often it's because someone called them up, or someone sent them an email, or someone, alerting them to that story. It so happens that elite schools have the dollars to hire big marketing teams who are very aggressive in reaching out to journalists and ensuring their stories get told. In that sense, it's quite simple. But you're right, the journalists themselves have an obligation to try and look beyond the tiny fraction of schools that they end up quoting in the paper. It is, I mean, I'm guilty of this myself, I'm quite sure. If you analyzed every science story I've ever written over the course of my entire career, you would see a tremendous bias towards exclusive schools, even though those schools are not, it's not a reflection of the quality of the research coming out of higher education. It's a reflection of how good the marketing arm is and how lazy science journalists can get sometimes.
Now, I mean, we're obviously right now communicating in oral. We're not doing a chat. Were there skills you learn as a journalist that you lean on now when you're telling your stories, whether to an audience like this or in your podcast format?
Yeah, I think so. A lot. I mean, a lot of, a journalist's job, a science journalist in particular's job is 80% of it is explanation. You're introducing someone to something that they probably don't know a lot about. That's very different from writing about politics. If I write about Joe Biden, you know who Joe Biden is. I don't need to tell you, I don't need to define Congress when I talk about Congress. If I'm writing about a Supreme Court opinion, you know what the Supreme Court is and you know it issues opinions, right? That is not true in science. So you have this obligation up front to explain things and explain things in a way that you don't lose your reader. You make it too hard for good reason, the reader's going to stop reading, right? So you have to learn how to gracefully and elegantly introduce new and complicated ideas to an audience and make them interested, curious about them, hearing more, right? And that, I was at the Washington Post for 10 years. That's what I learned at the Washington. That's what those 10 years were devoted to doing. And I lean on those skills every day. I mean, it's the most important preparation I did in my entire life.
Do you think that being at a public institution, our students and faculty have a specific role in terms of communicating science and the results of our research to the public?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, for one of the reasons I already stated, which is that when you understand the scale of public education in this country, you realize that the audience for or the constituency for the work that a CUNY does, or a big public education institution from another country, is much larger. So you have a bigger footprint on society. The footprint of the University of North Carolina in North Carolina is really large. The footprint of CUNY in New York is massive, right? The number of lives that are touched in some way by CUNY is extraordinary. I mean, it dwarfs NYU 10 times over. So that gives you a sense right away of the kind of potential. The other thing is the consequence of what you've been describing, which is this kind of inexplicable invisibility of some public institutions in the way that science writers write about science, is that it makes it much easier for state legislatures to starve those schools because they think they're irrelevant, right? They think, why do I need to pay attention to these schools? I never hear about them. And that's so there's a reason why you do want to bang your own drum if you're a state university, because you are, in some sense, hostage to the preferences of the state legislature.
I mean, getting back to what you're talking about, Dillard University as being this incredible producer of, in the case you're talking about, Black students who go on to physics. Is there ways you think that as STEM educators, we can make science more accessible to more diverse audiences?
Yeah, I would, I always remember I have a cousin who grew up in Long Island in a relatively poor area, and he was a very good student. But when he got to college, he realized that his high school had offered a fraction of the AP courses. It's a familiar story to anyway, that school kids from fancy suburban high schools had taken. As a result, he and everyone else at that school who didn't come from wealthy suburban high schools was at a disadvantage, and huge disadvantage. I mean, he told me he basically spent the first year, he and his roommates, who were all in the same boat, spent the first year playing catch up. And it took an incredible effort, and he could very easily have dropped out. That's nuts to me. Why it's bad enough that we ask certain kinds of students to endure all kinds of hardships and disadvantages and roadblocks that other wealthier students don't. But to also have it be the case that we are literally bringing in some students from certain schools with less educational preparation is, to my mind, criminal. We're making it it's really hard to compete in a strong STEM program at a university if you haven't had the same academic preparation in high school as some of your peers. So solving that problem, which I'm not, a million people have talked about this, but that would be a really useful first step. And the second thing I would say is that, and I think we're finally getting some attention to it, but money, cost considerations are obviously huge for many people from less advantaged communities. I mean, really, they effectively can mean the difference between going to college and not going to college, or sticking out in a difficult, STEM is a difficult undergraduate discipline. And it's really hard to stick it out if you are working 2 part-time jobs, right? Like, this isn't rocket science. Like, you try doing organic chemistry when you have to leave every day and do a 4-hour shift at wherever place, right? Like, that kind of stuff we don't talk enough about that. And those are all, if you're in that situation, it's a lot easier to study poetry. It really is, because your homework load is probably a fraction of what it is if you're studying physics.
And your father was a mathematician. He didn't force you into STEM?
No, he was, I had the mellowest father. My brother was very good at math. I was pretty good, but he just wanted me to do what made me happy.
A good father. So when you're, being bombarded by the high-priced marketing schools saying, write this story or that story, what's the calculus you do to decide, okay, I'm going to spend the time and effort, there's a story here?
Well, it depends. There was one calculation that I made when I was at the Washington Post, because there I was writing relatively short stories and news-driven stories. So if I heard from someone that somebody had made a medical breakthrough, that's a very, very big deal, discovered some new thing, and I thought I could explain it, and it was of relevance to the readers, I would do the story, and I'd do the story that day, right? Now I'm not in daily journalism. Now I'm interested in, does the thing that the person is talking to me, does it have some broader relevance? Can I tie it into some larger theme? Does it reflect on an issue that I care passionately about? Is the person who made the people who made the discovery, are they interesting in other ways? So now I'm much more interested in doing kind of reflective storytelling. And so what I'm curious about is different from what I used to be curious about.
I want to give, the folks in the audience, this is not only supposed to be a conversation between me and Malcolm, but we're about a little over halfway through, give some people opportunity. I see Sarah, who's Fassard, who I see has a good question in the chat. Sarah, do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm a graduate student here, and I do a lot of science communication work at the school. And so my question was I tend to view sort of us as graduate students and the professors at CUNY, we really have access to this public that we're trying to seek out, like this target audience of these types of students that CUNY has. Like, we see them all the time when we teach them and when we have them in our classroom. And so we have the spot and the chance to kind of practice this science communication skill. So then my question is, are there different techniques or ways that you approach writing in journalism that we could take into our classrooms to really ensure that the students are taking these topics that we're learning and bringing them home to their families or to their roommates or to whatever community members that they're interacting with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful question that I could answer for the next 4 hours, but a couple of things come to mind. One is that one thing I've always tried to do when I write about complicated but interesting topics is to work a lot by analogy. So, being able to kind of illustrate conceptually what you're arguing about by appealing to something that's a lot more accessible is really, really important. You should always look for analogies. I've always wanted, at some point when I retire, I would love to teach a class, and in high school or in college. And I've always wanted, I'm a big basketball fan. I would love to teach a math class which only talks about basketball, where all we do is talk about basketball statistics, what they mean, how you calculate them. And I wouldn't even, that's a kind of teaching by analogy. I suspect there are a great deal more basketball fans in a typical high school classroom than there are people who are yearning to learn about statistics, right? But many people don't realize it's the same thing. You play with stats every time you try to evaluate how good a basketball player is. And so I think there's, if we make it about basketball and not about statistics, all of a sudden I feel like you've quadrupled the number of students whose ears perk up. That's one thing. The second thing is, like, I think it's really important to communicate how exciting a lot of this is. So one thing I always try to do when I'm describing someone's work is to give the reader or the listener some sense of how thrilling the researcher finds his or her work. Like, there's a reason they do it, and you need to communicate that reason. Like, it's not drudgery. They're doing it because they find it really cool, and you just need to find some way to describe why it's cool, right? Why does it matter? Why is it exciting, to you to have done X, Y, or Z, to have figured out X, Y, or Z? That's like, I remember years ago, my dad was a mathematician, and I once wrote a story that I didn't understand a thing about the story. It was about someone had discovered the largest number in the world or something, which I still don't understand, like, how that's possible. Anyway, there was a mathematical thing for this incredibly large number. So I called my father, told him about this, and I quoted him in the story, and his quote was, long pause, oh my, that's really large. So the point was, like, I'm never going to explain to a layperson exactly the full mathematical significance of the fact that someone discovered this. But I can communicate the fact that someone like my dad found it really cool. And so sometimes that's like a lot of what you have to do to instill. People should be in awe of science, right? That's a huge role of science writing.
Thanks. Ata? I don't know if you're.
Hi, thanks. So I had a question about the illustration that go along with science reporting, because I noticed when I used to teach classes, like, the illustrations tend to help the students who don't parse things well through reading. And sometimes, like, the illustrations are gorgeous and beautiful, but I feel like they're not doing the job of just, like, if I look at the images, I should be able to get a sense of the picture instead of saying, like, and I do appreciate, like, the artwork and, like, the fantasy that goes with it, but I feel like, do you think that would help more to have more, like, introductory diagrams, so that way you don't have to, like, spend, like, a paragraph or two being like, this is this. You can just be like, this is, like, a schematic, but not scary. But you guys have great illustrators there. So I'm like, do you have scientific illustrators, or do you just hire out illustrators?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There's a lot of productive work that could be done with intelligent illustration. And it's a folly to think that if you're talking about something complicated that your primary tool should be words. Images, graphs, charts, all kinds of things can do enormous work in explaining something. The problem in a magazine, like for example, The New Yorker, is that the writer does not have control at all about the illustration. There is a separate department of illustrators who may have no particular understanding of science or the thing that you're describing, who are simply, they are doing decoration. They are not doing illustration, right? Illustration is something that directly helps you understand, illustrates the point being made. They're not doing that. They're doing artwork. And that was always, when I wrote a lot for The New Yorker, that was always a source of great frustration to me. I also didn't understand why I couldn't use charts and graphs and figures in the text of my articles, which they wouldn't. I mean, now people are getting better about that, but it was very hard back then. There are some times when, all you really need is, like, here's a good example. A lot of people are talking now about how crime is up in New York City, right? And they see, oh, it's up, murders were up, whatever, 8% over last year. And people are, talking about it's the return of the bad old days. That is a conversation that would be greatly assisted by a simple chart, which tracks the per capita murder rate in New York City from 1970 to the present day. And if you looked at that chart, you would realize, oh, although murders were up, it was so much worse. It was 5 times worse, at least 5 times worse in 1989 than it is today, right? And you have no context, but what a simple chart can give you is an immediate context for the numbers that are flying around. And without that chart, it's really hard to communicate context. And also what that chart can do is, I can also break down, give you really simple nuance. I can show you all violent crime. I can show you burglary. I can show you murder all by itself. And then I can show you, say, rape. Now, what you see is that sexual assaults are as high as they were at the worst moment in New York City history. Everything else is 5 times lower. So that now we understand, now we understand why people are getting so anxious and alarmed. It's a very specific kind of crime that's come back. It's not all crime. And that I can do that. I could give you one chart, which you could look at in 10 seconds, and you would be smarter about the conversation we're having in New York City right now about crime. And the failure of journalists to, we're so in love with words, we would rather spend 3,000 words describing that. You don't need to. One smart illustration, and you go, oh, okay, that's what's going on.
That's why students, we always say, work on your figures first, and then,
yes.
then fill in your text. And one of the great things is that we have alumni that love us. I see one of the alumni asked a question. Roxy, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Hi, Professor Bromberg. Hello, Gladwell, Michael Gladwell. Very happy to be here. Yeah, I joined because I saw you were giving a talk. I have a few questions as a science communicator and also like a alumni, CUNY alumni. So you talk a lot about what's known as the elite institution cognitive disorder, right? So how do we really tackle that as a science communicators or also as a teachers? And also what do we collectively as a society can do with that, belief that if you don't go to Ivy school, you're probably going to fail or you're not going to be as successful. I know you've been talking about it for years now, but nothing really changed. I think the discrepancy is even worse. And as you mentioned before, this, is obviously money driven, right? And we know that a lot of the school contribute to the political campaign and so forth. So there's, I don't know how we can really solve that. That's my very lengthy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that we do have in this society an acute obsession with a very small number of very small institutions, which are nearly impossible for most people to get into ever. And we've erected a series of fictions around them, among them that if you didn't go to one of those schools, you're not as smart as those who did. And that if you didn't go to one of those schools, you somehow impaired your career in a meaningful way, your life chances. Both of those are demonstrably false. How do you combat that? Well, for example, at my company, one of the things we do is we don't, if you apply, you're not allowed to disclose your undergraduate institution. So you can't tell us. So it doesn't matter. We're not hiring anyone because they went to a fancy school, and we're not ignoring someone because they didn't go to a fancy school. We've just decided not to. We're interested in you, the applicant, not the brand value of your resume. If more institutions followed that path, we'd be a lot better off. In other words, I have no problem with somebody wanting to go to a highly selective college and study with fancy professors and, eat at a fantastic dining hall. I have no problem with that. I just don't think that you should expect that particular privilege to make an ongoing difference in your life. And if employers stop playing that game, and if they simply say, no, I'm not gonna allow people to disclose that on their resumes, we'd all be better off. The other thing is that, but a lot of this is also driven by parents. And parents of teenagers are just, in this country, middle-class parents, are just unbelievably anxious about the college their kids go to. And I don't know what to do about parental anxiety. I mean, I just think it's irrational, and it's kind of nuts, and it's ruining the teenage years of a lot of teenagers, and it's causing a lot of parents to lose sleep and lose hair and, have too much stress in their life. We just have to chill. But I don't have a good answer beyond that.
As a father of a high school senior, I definitely appreciate that. But I guess now I can do like Zoom bingo. We asked a student, an alum, a research faculty, now a tenure track faculty, Michael Grossberg, who has the doomsday clock behind it. You want to ask your question, Mike?
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so I put in the chat, but there's the cost disease, right, in the service sector, right, and that makes education and healthcare and things that you require humans and can't be turned completely automated, more and more relatively expensive. So I mean, there's a sense in which partly there's probably a lot of waste in the system, right? But partly it is it's harder to make it more efficient, right? Mm-hmm. And yet at some point we have no choice, right? We have to figure this out. And obviously there are big public schools in the country that are trying. I think CUNY is a little bit more balkanized. We all have our campuses, and so sometimes we're not. It's for both better and worse. California, I think University of Berkeley is doing a lot of interesting things, but on the other hand, their graduate students just went on strike because they feel they're being exploited. So I mean, from what you've seen in the big public schools, who's getting it right, and who should we be looking at? Oh
wow. Well, I'll answer this in a number of different ways. One is, I've often thought that in American higher education, there is insufficient differentiation. In other words, there's too few models that people are following, and too many schools are trying to do the same thing, which is to produce a very expensive, exclusive elite education. And what we need is 10 different models or more. We should have people who are, and it's starting to happen a little bit. I suspect there's more diversity in the kind of institution today than there was 10 years ago, but still insufficient. There should be schools that are super bare bones. There should be schools that have really aggressive work study programs. My father taught for years at the University of Waterloo, which for its engineering students has had a co-op program in place since the beginning of the school. I mean, for 60 years. That should be way more prevalent than it is now. I mean, it just makes the education so much more affordable. The local employers love it. The students love it. It's a no-brainer. Why every engineering faculty, or why half the engineering departments in this country don't follow that, I don't know. But that's something there should be more kind of experimentation with. There should be more experimentation with, weird schools. Like, there's the great book school in Annapolis, Maryland, St. John's, where you study the classics. Why is there only one school like that? There should be more. Like, my point is that, like, we've sort of I think over time, the higher ed world has lost the desire to innovate in a kind of interesting and creative way. And everyone wants to be Harvard, and everyone can't be Harvard. And so maybe that doesn't really answer your question, but one of the ways that people could innovate is in trying models that are radically less expensive. Whether that means, the kinds of things I've talked about, work study programs and those kinds of things. There's a little school out of Michigan that's trying a pay it forward model, where you go for free, but they expect you to pay your tuition back over the course of your life, which, if they pull that off, would be super interesting. But I don't know, I just think there should be more aggressive use of digital learning where appropriate as a way of bringing down costs. I mean, there's like I said, a bunch of, I often think that there should be way more study abroad. And if you did, study abroad done right could be quite inexpensive, right? My family's apart from Jamaica. I think the single best thing for students at NYU would be to get out of their privileged little corner, go and spend a year in Kingston, Jamaica. Like, that would expand your horizons in a really, really good way, right? And Kingston, Jamaica is not an expensive place to get an education, right? So it's not going to cost $60,000 the year in Kingston. But there's all kinds of things I think that productively should be done. The other one, I think, this is a semi-serious one. I'm a very serious runner, and I've often joked with other runners that there should be a school that just lets in runners. Why not? Runners are like disciplined introverts who are not afraid of hard tasks. That's like if I was to pick a group of people I wanted to go to college with for 4 years, it would be runners. So, like, why doesn't someone do something wacky like that? I mean, the door is open, I think, for a lot more innovation.
It's opening night of the indoor season at the Armory. You can go for high school. You can recruit at that tonight.
Yes.
Chris, you had a question about how to get your research kind of into a larger audience.
Yeah, so a lot of us, in order to like advance in our careers, have to have very specific, maybe even niche areas of research in order to like advance the field. And I think sometimes it's easy to get so zoomed in on the topic that it's hard to then relate those findings back to a broader, less niche audience. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on how to kind of translate the more specific to a broader audience and make it appealing to perhaps a less expert audience.
Yeah. I mean, the obvious way that, there has been increased interest among academics in recent years in trying to write, popular nonfiction. I wonder, though, if there aren't more kind of effective ways of doing that. So, here's a for example, what if someone were to create a kind of YouTube channel in which once a year, we asked you to do a lecture for your students where you did a big picture, why I study what I study, what excites me, what's cool. And you and 100 other academics like you put that lecture up on a YouTube channel and just see what happens. And, the kind of thing that a high school student who's trying to figure out what they are interested in studying in college could go to that and could click on, I don't know what you do, but let's say you're a biochemist. You're in some corner, some fascinating corner of biochemistry. But in that lecture, you say, here's why my little corner is not a corner, right? Here's what it connects to. Here's what I do in the morning. Like, there are ways, I think, to kind of communicate the excitement that is felt by, because what's always struck me in years and years and years of writing about academics is how much excitement they have about what they do. It's really rare, A lot of accountants do not like what they do. A lot of lawyers hate what they do. Academics really kind of like what they do. And that idea, communicating to a high school senior that whereas lots of lawyers hate getting up in the morning and going to work, a lot of academics do not. And maybe if you're interested in having a productive life, but so that, things like that are ways, I think, are indirect ways of opening a window to the world on what you're doing.
For the honor of the final question, we'll go to Kevin. You had your hand up, waited patiently.
I did. Malcolm, thanks very much for speaking with us today for many reasons, including I'm a fellow U of T veteran. So glad to have you on the call. And that's actually kind of where I want to take this. Did my undergrad and PhD on this side of the border, and then postdoctoral training on University of Toronto to give me an experience in a very different setting in many regards. And it was eye-opening to Canadian public education. Thinking a bit about innovation, I love what you were talking about previously about, why aren't we seeing more iterative models there? You've had a unique chance to see things on both sides of the border. Do you think the Canadians are more innovative? I mean, you were calling out Waterloo, but more broadly, thoughts?
Well, I think that there are certain things the Canadian system does really, really well historically. Building and supporting large, affordable, high quality public institutions. That's their, there's certain things the American system does really well, and that is building highly elite, world-class research institutions. There is no equivalent to MIT really anywhere in the world, or any equivalent to Rockefeller University in, here in New York City, or any number of, that's the thing that America does really well. But I don't know I've never understood why you can't do both. Particularly a country as large as the United States, it shouldn't be impossible to simultaneously say, look, there's a role for these super specialized, really head in the clouds, hardcore, and at the same time, have a really, really broad base. The NBA, the equivalent would be if the NBA said, we no longer think anyone needs to play basketball in junior high and high school or college. We're just going to cream skim the top and just create an elite league. We would say that's nuts. How do you create an elite league unless you have a broad base of kids who are playing basketball from the get-go? The American educational approach is not dissimilar to that crazy NBA example I just gave. We think you can have you can sustain this amazing elite basketball league without feeding the pool. We've been able to escape the consequences of that by importing lots of really brilliant people from other countries. But the challenges we have are so vast now. We need so many more people in science doing good work that's not a game we can play anymore. We've got to we can't neglect all kinds of talent the way we have been for years and years. So anyway, I would say it's possible to have the best of both worlds. It really is. Agreed. Thank you.
All right. That went by very quickly. I would like to a few announcements. First, if you enjoy today's program and want to learn more about communicating your science, I encourage you to look at the Science Communications Academy website hosted on the ASRC's website, where you can find past webinars as well as toolkits to help you present your science to a public audience, and future webinars which we'll be having in the spring semester. And for graduate students whose interest is piqued, we now sponsor a Science Communications Fellowship every year. So look for the call for that next spring for the subsequent academic year. If you're interested in learning more about science and science to the public, as you know, I run a City of Science event. Our second and final one of the semester is Monday night about language development, 6:30 in person or online. Look at the GC website for the details. It's free. And now to Malcolm, thank you very much. I encourage everyone to listen to the Revisionist History podcast, and even his feature on a CUNY alum. He did a 10-part series on Paul Simon, who has 2 CUNY degrees. So we like that. So thanks a lot, Malcolm. Wish you a very happy and healthy holiday season.
You too. Bye-bye.